I'll kick off and offer the concluding remarks, but the bulk of the presentation will be done by Andrew, who's done all the heavy lifting on this. So this project was funded by ERSA, so thanks very much for the support. It's using the tax data to look at issues of business formation and business decline, business deaths. As it turned out, Andrew's been working for a year to try and make sense of the data, to manipulate and work with this data. So a huge amount of groundwork has gone into this, and that's constrained us in a way in terms of arriving at definitive conclusions. But just by way of background, so the common assumption is that our economy is stagnant, standing still. Low growth, but not just low growth, also fixed in terms of the structure of the economy, with continuing dominance of minerals, continuing dominance of the financial sector, linked historically to minerals, the concentration of ownership in the economy. That's the kind of conventional wisdom, that it's a high level of path dependency or inertia in our economy. So we were prompted by this question, when you lift up the bonnet of the economy, are there actually more changes going on than it seems at face value, in terms of shifts in firms and changes in jobs? So we compare the extent of change across firms of different sizes, across different sectors of the economy, across different places, and across different points in time, using this enormous data set that we now have. And there are 6 discrete components of change that we're interested in: the births and deaths of firms, and then the opening and closures of establishments or branches within a firm. So you have a firm as a legal entity, you then have a physical sub-component of that firm, which is an establishment or a branch or a plant or a shop or an outlet, an operation within that firm. And then we are interested in, alongside the business components, the job changes, creation and loss of jobs among existing firms and establishments, in situ changes, in other words, as well as job changes from the new births and the branch openings. Okay, so we're firms and jobs unpacking basic components of change. So this is essential groundwork that's possible and has never been done in South Africa. It's possible because of this new granular information from the tax data. The international experience, very, very briefly, is that new and small firms create the bulk of jobs in most economies. They also are paths out of poverty. They alleviate poverty, as we've just discussed this morning. They also introduce new products and processes. New firms are better at promoting innovation in the economy because they're not constrained by the existing operations and culture of a large corporation, and they act as a challenge function to stimulate and keep big business on its toes. So there are all sorts of valuable benefits from having turnover of firms in an economy. And finally, cities in the literature act as incubators of new firms because of the variety of services, financing, premises for business, and other infrastructure to enable and facilitate business formation and growth. So let me hand over to Andrew.
Thanks, Ivan. So I think most people here are familiar with the spatial tax panel and the SARS administrative data at National Treasury, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but we've essentially used the same cleaning process as we do for the spatial tax panel, using the disaggregated version of this to build this new data set off of that's focused on establishment changes and the employment related to that. So I'm going to leave that there. As part of this, we needed to develop a new framework to define exactly what these components of change would be at an establishment level. So if you think about it practically, first you would have the birth of a firm. That would be the first time a firm appears in the data as a firm, not as a branch or establishment, although there would be branches appearing with that. You would then have branch openings, and that would be an existing firm that has a new location that shows up in the data. We would then have relocations, and that would be when a new branch opens up, but higher than a specific threshold. In this case, 50% of the employees from that establishment have been moved from another establishment that no longer exists in a previous year. Then we have branch closings, and that's where the branch would disappear, but the firm continues to exist. And then we have firm deaths, and that would be the firm completely disappears from the data. For the purposes of this study, we're not going to focus on the relocations. We're focusing on the other 4 components of change, although there's a whole research angle that you could go down focusing on those relocations and understanding where businesses might be relocating to. In terms of bringing this into jobs and job flows, you would have these 4 components of change that I've mentioned, as well as then also understanding 2 other components of change, which would be those in situ hires or fires. That would be existing companies that haven't changed premises that would be hiring people or firing people from those premises. So I'm going to try and move through this quite quickly. So if there's anything that catches your eye, we can come back to that in the Q&A. So we first looked at this from the perspective of establishment creation and destruction, where the top half of this figure, the dark blue and light blue, are showing establishment creation, and the bottom half, the dark brown and light brown, are showing the establishment destruction. And with the yellow line showing the net changes year on year within that overall number of establishments, but attributed to each of these components of change. Now, despite only 3.4% net growth pre-COVID, we can still see there's quite a lot of dynamism in the broader space, with 1/3 of all establishments either being created or destroyed on an annual basis. So there's a lot of churn within the sector, or within the broader space. Firm deaths and births account for 8.8% and 6.3% of establishments pre-COVID. Branch openings and closures account for 9.2 and 8.2 of establishments on average per year pre-COVID. And these branch openings and closures account for slightly over 50% of those branch changes. So they kind of equally contributing to changes in the dynamics. And I think important to note that for the most part, these cancel each other out. So that marginal change is almost completely cancelled out, because who's ever coming in there's other people going out. And the other big point to take away from this slide is really the impact of COVID, which was quite stark in those latter years, and really driven almost exclusively by firm deaths and not any of the other components of change. And there's no sign of stabilization in the 2021-2022 tax year, which is the last year of the data. We then look at this from a job flow perspective to understand how these different components of change are influencing employment, or jobs rather. And now we've added in the 2 additional components of in situ hires and fires, which, as you can see, take up the bulk of the contribution to those job creation or job destruction, with over 70% of job creation and job destruction attributed to in situ hiring and firing. I think the other big takeaway here is that there's only 1% net growth pre-COVID, which is relatively low, and I think we've seen that from other sources of evidence that we are seeing the stagnation in the broader economy. But despite that, there is a lot of churn. So 1 in 4 jobs were reallocated, and reallocated here means either created or destroyed. Again, similar to the establishments, each component of change roughly cancels each other out. So the net effects aren't that big. One other thing to note here, I think, is that the majority of the change is being driven by let me come back to that. I think I'd bring it up another slide. And then lastly, just looking at the impact of COVID here, obviously you can see there's a massive shock in that 2021 tax year, where the impacts of COVID are felt. This is largely due to that corresponding increase we saw at establishment level in firm deaths, but there is some stabilization from an employment perspective, which we didn't see in establishment level, and this is almost exclusively driven by in situ hiring, where existing firms are absorbing the labor force into their existing structures, as opposed to new branches or new firms being able to accommodate those people. We then take this and look at it from a geographic perspective, looking at settlement typologies, and I think no surprises here that metros are much more dynamic and account for a lot more change in absolute terms, and we can see that with the top figure, which is showing the absolute job creation and destruction, the bottom figure, which is showing the percentage of employees within each of these areas, changes the narrative slightly. And despite metros being significantly more dynamic in absolute terms, in relative terms, they're only slightly more dynamic than the smaller settlement typologies. I think of particular concern is the high net firm death rate, relative to firm births, which suggests, metros aren't acting as nurseries for new firms. They're actually graveyards where there's more firms dying in them than being created, if we're talking about new businesses coming in. And one of the anomalies was small towns, which appear to be outperforming more urbanized areas. But this is largely due to high in situ hiring and firing, or in situ hiring and firm births, rather. Part of this is also due to a very low base, and that kind of accentuates the relative growth in small towns. We also then drill down into the metros and look at those a bit more specifically. A couple key takeaways here. I think obviously looking at the Gauteng metros, they have the highest reallocation rates, specifically Joburg and Ekurhuleni. But despite this, they have low net job growth. More firms or more employees are losing jobs in these areas, just as many as are being created. Cape Town is one of the anomalies with the highest net growth rate, and this is driven largely by in situ hiring, suggesting that existing firms are really driving this trend in Cape Town of where their net job growth is coming from. Ekurhuleni and Nelson Mandela Bay have completely stagnated over the study period, and both of these are driven largely by in situ firing and firm deaths. So of particular concern to those two municipalities. And then I think important to note here that over 70% of change is driven by in situ changes. So this is the net change within each of those categories. In situ hiring and firing cancel each other out, and if you look at what's actually contributing to job growth, it's actually the establishment births. The branch openings and the firm births. We then look at this from a firm size perspective to see the dynamics here, and I think we had the kind of clearest trends here in terms of relation to different components of change. So if you look at the top figure, we're looking at the absolute number of employees, which large firms being the kind of biggest lever and being the most dynamic in terms of the sheer volume of job flows. And this is largely driven by in situ hiring and firing, which also intuitively makes sense. I think it's also important to be aware of the SA labor market and the skewness of it to these large firms, which is over 61% of employees working for large firms, and I think that this is quite different to what we see from other middle-income countries in OECD. The other big takeaway here is that if we look at it in relative terms, we see that small and micro establishments are much more dynamic. And actually account for over 70% of net job growth across all job growth if we break it down into each of the firm sizes. And I think, coming back to my point about large firms being the single biggest lever, their dominance and stagnation really drive the whole South African economy. So if they underperform, the rest of the economy performs. You can argue that we might want to have more micro and small businesses, but unless we can change that rapidly, the easiest way to actually turn things around is to focus on those large firms. I'm going to try and move a bit faster because I am running out of time. But we just broke it down by sector here, and I'm just going to pull a couple of key points out here. The first is that retail creates the most net jobs, followed by agriculture, education, and public service, and that's in absolute terms. The most dynamic sectors are retail, manufacturing, and admin services sector. However, the latter two have low net growth. The mining sector is a standout here for being in massive decline, with the highest level of net job losses driven largely by firm deaths. Government-related sectors have the lowest reallocation rates, and that speaks to Christoph's point yesterday about entropy within the government sector and potential responses to market conditions. That security that you have in that job. And lastly, just accommodation and food services have the highest, specifically firm birth and death rates, followed by constructions in terms of those standalone firms. We then did some modeling work, and the point of this really wasn't to try and accurately predict something. The purpose was really to understand the relationships, knowing that the variables we have at our disposal aren't necessarily going to help us perfectly predict whether a firm was born, died, a branch was opened or closed, or it remained open. What we did see is, despite the poor model performance, I think the pseudo R-squared was 0.28. The results confirm what we were able to see in the descriptive statistics, with the firm size characteristics really dominating from a coefficient perspective, driving whether a firm would be born or died, or a branch opened or closed. And I'll leave that there for now. Sorry. And then we also plugged this into a random forest classifier for the sole purpose of just getting a better sense of the scale at which each of these variables that we did have in the data set would be contributing to whether a branch opened or closed or remained open. And this again confirmed what we were seeing in the descriptive results, with firm size being the strongest contributor to define what type of component of change that establishment would be experiencing.
Couple of minutes of conclusions. You can see the amount of work involved to try and organize this data set into serve a different purpose. So we see, contrary to what we expected, a sizable amount of business change and job flows. There's a lot of churn going on underneath the bonnet when you lift it up, despite stagnation overall. Every year, pre-COVID, because COVID has changed things, 9% almost of establishments are born each year, right? It's a very significant level of new business formation every year, and deaths slightly lower than that, also significant. Branch openings, even higher level of establishments each year represent new branches being opened, equated with closures, slightly less. High level of worker hiring. 12% of all jobs every year are new hires, offset by high levels of firing. Why have these shifts and shake-ups not led to economic progress? This is the obvious puzzle posed by these findings. You would expect to see, with churn, with change, new businesses formed, new branches opening, increases in productivity, more dynamism, progress in the outcomes, the net outcomes, but we see very little. Sluggish employment growth, only 1% per annum, particularly large firms are particularly sluggish. The dominant growth has been in wholesale and retail, as Andrew has said, 40,000 of those 110,000 additional jobs, but we know wholesale and retail is non-tradable, low productivity, low multiplier effects on the economy. It's not a driver of growth and development. Entry seems to be a straightforward substitution. That's what's going on. New businesses are simply substituting or replacing existing firms. New branches are simply replacing closed branches rather than enhancing. Clearly evident in the hospitality sector, with the highest rates of births and deaths, but only 10,000 net additional jobs every year. Construction held up. We were chatting, Saul and I, before about, the kind of quick win in terms of getting the economy growing. Highest level of job reallocation, but lost 7,000 jobs a year over this period. And finally, the metros underperform on new firm formation, quite unexpected. So this underperformance we've seen in other areas is also showing up in terms of new business formation. The metros create most jobs in absolute terms, but they also shed most jobs. So the in situ is dominant there. And COVID, another outstanding feature of this, has had a devastating impact on the killing off of firms. Very sizable level of business deaths during this short period. So what underlies this? Obviously, we don't have full explanations given the limited nature of this data, but there seems to be an element of a crowded platform, if we can call it that kind of effect, with an insufficient demand to sustain the growth of new enterprises, right? This explains why a new business stands on the platform and pushes an old one off the other side. Saturated markets, limited demand, suggesting maybe the IMF is right, criticizing the government or the Reserve Bank for keeping interest rates high, right? There are all sorts of factors behind low demand, but maybe that's one of them. The second, deeper cause is the structural obstacles. These are inhibiting the growth of all firms across the board, new firms, existing firms. The structural constraints of infrastructure and other things we've talked about could be massive here. And of course, this will be most apparent in the cities where we see these massive challenges of infrastructure collapse and so on. So, kind of doomy conclusions, but I think an interesting new take on dynamics of change in the economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is absolutely wonderful work, especially seeing this very different across firm size and the different locations. I just wanted to know, is your panel based on the CIT records or the VAT records?
Should I take it? So it's built off of the PIT records, but we actually don't use the SARS definition of establishment size or firm size. We create it based on the number of employees that work for that firm.
And is your firm base drawn from the VAT records or from the CIT records?
And neither. We're using the PAYE.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I think we've done this for agriculture on the VAT records, because there's a lot of sole proprietors who are employing a lot of people, and especially we find similar that the concentration of employment is very high in large firms, regardless whether it's non-agriculture or agriculture, but also that this churn is happening, at least on the establishment, is at the small firm size. And I think that's important to see. It's kind of the stock versus the flow that's very different by firm size. And I think this is, I think it's nice to see that we're seeing very similar things come out of this. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the slides. We do something similar, but I think maybe not as sophisticated as this approach. I just wanted to see that my understanding was correct. One of your last slides indicated the expected, shall we say, life of a unit. Was that correct? If it's like in demographics, it's in humans it would be your life expectancy. Was that what one of your last slides were predicting?
No, they weren't predicting life expectancy. They were predicting whether an establishment would either remain unchanged, close, open, or be an open branch, be a closed branch, be a birth or a death.
Yeah. Because I'm sure you read the OECD manuals or the UN ECE that also deals with this. So there's often discussions around whether you should worry about the mergers and splits and things in the businesses, and also try to get an idea if you're more likely to succeed as a business with a given firm size in a given industry. So maybe a medium-sized accommodation establishment has the best chance to live for more than 20 years compared to a small manufacturer and that type of thing. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks. And that's also, there was a separate road we started going down that came back, which was that kind of survival rate and looking at that size. But given the panel's only from 2014 to 2022 or 2023, your survival rates aren't kind of a long enough time series to kind of deep dive into that.
It did show, though, a high level of drop-off, a high level of failure, right, within the first few years, as international studies have found as well.
And I guess the legal entity form doesn't really make a big enough difference for whether people would be sole proprietors, partnerships, PTYs, PTY limiteds. I think that wouldn't make such a big difference.
Well, potentially, I think one of the limitations of the data is that it's using the PAYE data, and so people like sole proprietors actually fall out of it. So that's not captured in there.
Right. So, I was just wondering, with the machine learning feature importance analysis you did, why you didn't include the time indicators to kind of get the importance of exogenous shocks?
It's a good question. It was included, but when we were preparing the final model, I couldn't find the data set for that. So it's a good point. It's a mistake on our side. Okay. And it was included. I don't know. Getting it out the lab, I didn't have a chance to get another version out that we could include in the presentation or the paper.
Okay. And the other one would be, did you look perhaps at the intersection between specific metros and specific industries to see if there are kind of outliers in terms of the performance, either for good or for bad? I noted that you said that the metros tend to do worse on aggregate, but are there specific metros that are incubating industries that can be picked up in the data?
I think it's a good place for us to take this forward. I mean, we just kind of, too much information, too many angles, and I think there's a lot of room to actually take this and go deeper into a specific sector within a specific municipality and say, is Cape Town the incubator for the boat building sector or whatever it may be. But we're also hoping that we can release this data as part of a expanded spatial tax panel so that other people can also do that research as well.
Well, excellent work, very interesting.
Thanks, Christoph.
I just wanted to also echo the kind of appreciation for this. It really helps us cast kind of light on an area of work that we've never really had adequate data. I mean, I've been involved in some survey work that's tried to look at this in panels. This is really fantastic to be able to have this kind of data. Just to sort of, not an urging to yourselves, but I know if Shirley was here, she would have made this point about the frontier of the CRPC registrations, which really needs to be taken forward, and maybe the city support program can try and encourage a better analysis and a better recording of data. You get about 500,000 registrations of companies annually, if you average the past few years, new registrations in the CRPC, and about 10,000 deaths, and a lot of those registrations and those firms are non-performing in terms of the CRPC's reporting requirements, in terms of submitting annual returns and all of those sorts of things. So we don't quite know a lot of what's going on in there, but there's perhaps firm formation dynamics and death dynamics that are locked into that space, which talks to your other forms of business formation and the frequent non-reporting of or non-paying of UIF and PAYE and all of those sorts of things, of which many of those firms are sort of, end up dying relatively quickly, deaths, because they're unable to sustain their legal presence, or they re-register anew very rapidly. And I think the CRPC at times, if you look at their reports to Parliament and their annual reports, they have tried to interrogate that, but it seems to have just not been pushed really beyond a very basic level of sort of aggregate analysis.
And just to touch on that, the CIPC data has been shared with National Treasury now. The challenge is it's not de-identified in the same way that the SARS data is, but there's plans in place to start doing that. And it's also going to be part of that broader data exchange. It's one of the early kind of easier or low-hanging fruits to target for the South African Integrated Data Lake and the DIPS program in terms of sharing that information broadly within government.
Just on that, can I say, if anybody knows of particular reports that have tried to use these different data sources, please share them with us, because this is kind of a new field for our work.
Hey, Andrew, Ivan, thanks so much. Second time I'm seeing this, and it's even better than the last time. I do think sort of a key part of the story is that sort of firm births are marginally greater than firm deaths, so we're sort of seeing this marginal positive growth. My understanding, though, is that a lot of the measures for firm birth are sort of being constructed using the PAYE data, and I think as a result of that, what you're capturing as firm birth is probably firm birth plus firm rebirth. So sort of firms that were previously dormant that are maybe sort of operating again, especially sort of during those COVID periods. I think it sort of speaks to one of Glenn's points he made prior to this. I think maybe just a useful check here would be to actually just go into the CIT data, pull out all the firm IDs. The nice thing about the data set is there's actually a dormancy flag in that data set. So firms don't drop out of the CIT data set, they stay in there with the dormancy flag until that firm is either CIPC compliant again or that firm starts, you know, operations again. So I think a good thing would be to sort of pull those out, have a look at those dormancy flags, and just cross-reference every time you see a birth that it's not the case that this was a previously dormant firm that is simply operating again. And I think then if you're able to sort of split firm births by firm births and rebirths, it may even be the case that firm births are actually lower than firm deaths. And that additional bump of positive growth is actually coming from firms just being reinstated.
So just a clarification from my side, we do include the CIT data and the VAT data onto here, and that's actually how we define firms, is based on that firm tax reference number, with the caveat that, you know, there are cases where a firm might have multiple tax reference numbers, but for the most part, it's the clearest way for us to identify the firm. So this would capture those you wouldn't see it defined as a rebirth. And what we actually find with it, in terms of firms reporting and then dropping out for a year and then starting to report again, it's almost an insignificant number of both full-time equivalent employees or actual establishments as well. So I can't remember the number offhand, but it's really low. It's below 1%.
Can I just ask, did you see that in the COVID, particularly in the 2021? Any sign that that was?
I mean, it's something we haven't looked at specifically, but I would say, just trying to remember it offhand, I don't think there was any specific spike in that. I mean, we'd call it a disappearance of a firm. And there wasn't any spike in that variable at that point in time.
It would be important for us to know that before we say that this COVID deaths, high death rate in COVID is correct. If these are just dormant firms, some of them are dormant rather than absolute real deaths, but you're suggesting it didn't look like it.
Well, I'm also saying it won't be counted as a birth after. If it was dormant, it won't be a birth again. That firm still exists.
Right.
Yeah, it's linked back to that CIT definition of it.
Just a quick question from my side. Thank you for the excellent presentation. My question is from the modeling side. I have seen you've used random forest or kind of machine learning algorithms. And one of the limitations of this algorithms is when there is a class imbalance, the algorithm is biased towards the majority class. Have you seen that kind of thing, and how did you handle it?
It was one of our biggest challenges, because the remain unchanged class was 10 times bigger than all the other classes, which were all very similar. So we did do a downsampling of the data, just to make sure we could actually predict them efficiently.
Okay, that's great. Maybe another methodology suggestion in the future. This is wonderful. If you have a starting time and the end time, and if there are firms still functioning, is a statistical model which is called survival analysis. You can, if you want to model the survival of those firms, the curve. So there's just a model that you may just look at because it just tells you how long, or they just, this firm survive, a kind of thing. So just say this thing.
No, thanks for that.
Okay, last question.
Yeah, I think this is groundbreaking because, I mean, in terms of the data, we generally have not had anything closer to this in the longest time because most of the data that we had, it was just the projections. And this is like much more credible, which is a good way. But I think it would be much more interesting, perhaps, which is what other colleagues have raised, to look at the anchor sector in each metro. But I think it can also be sort of misleading because let me give you an example with Gauteng. As it is, the mining sector still play a much bigger role, but the way it's playing it within the Gauteng city region, where the firms that are located in Johannesburg, especially that are servicing the mining sector, they find it easier to access the coal belt in Mpumalanga, which is Witbank, Middelburg, and then they also find it easier to access Rustenburg because of the location. So the anchor sector, it may seem as agglomeration in Johannesburg, but the mining in the surrounding, look in the West Rand, then plays quite a significant role. It still plays a significant role in the economy of Johannesburg, which one may think about even the Cape Town, the role of Stellenbosch as the activities that are happening in Stellenbosch and their role in the contributions to the Cape Town economy may be quite significant and be undercounted because of that proximity. But I think it's one thing that as part of the work going forward, we may look into it about those sectors which basically anchor those economies as well. Thanks.
I think it's a great point. And I mean, part of where we need to take this further is actually looking at that sub-municipal level and seeing the trend spatially to say, well, it's not the mining houses or the ones that used to be in CBD or the ones that are in Rosebank now. It might be on the West Rand where we're seeing a big loss in mining jobs, for instance. But it's something we can do with the data because it is broken up into establishments and branches. And while there is evidence of some head office effects, we've been developing ways to deal with that, as well as it also only accounting for a very small amount of the total employees listed in that actual database. I think the number's 12% is what we've calculated at the moment. It's not insignificant, but it's most firms actually are listing the actual branch that people are working at.
How does mining compare with some other sectors in terms of the head office effect? Is it better or worse, would you say?
There's one or two mines that suffer from head office effect, but for the most part, they actually are. I think retail is one of the worst offenders, but mining actually is, I think there's one or two bad mining companies, and everyone else is listing employees actually working at the mine, or the closest town to that mine if it's in a rural area.
Guys, thank you so much.